I'd always prided myself on having the perfect life. A steady job as a construction foreman in a small Midwestern town, a warm home in the suburbs of Ohio, and a loving family that everyone envied. My name is Jason Miller, and for 10 years I believed that nothing could break the bond one shared with my wife, Emily, and our 10-year-old daughter, Sophie. Last Saturday was meant to be a celebration, a family gathering for Emily's sister's milestone birthday at our own home, with relatives, neighbors, and close friends all under one roof. The day was warm, the yard freshly mowed, and the scent of barbecue filled the air. Laughter and light chatter mingled with the clink of glasses as we enjoyed the afternoon outdoors. I had spent the morning making sure everything was perfect. I took pride in hosting and ensuring that every detail, from the arrangement of picnic tables to the carefully selected playlist, was just right. Emily floated around with a radiant smile, greeting guests and ensuring that Sophie was never out of sight. To any onlooker, that day was simply an idyllic family celebration then. As twilight began to settle, an unexpected guest arrived. I was in the back porch, finishing up some last-minute touches, when I noticed a sleek black sedan pull up in the driveway. I'd never seen that car before in our quiet cul-de-sac. Standing by the sedan was a tall, well-dressed man with a calm yet unsettling demeanor. His hair was dark, his eyes cool and observant. As he stepped out, he paused at the edge of the lawn and looked straight ahead toward the house. For a moment, our eyes met, even from a distance, and his gaze held something I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't friendly nor warm. It was filled with a quiet accusation, a knowing look that sent a chill down my spine. I watched as he strode toward the door with an air of confidence that didn't belong among the familiar faces of our family and friends. When Emily greeted him at the door, her expression shifted from polite cheerfulness to something like measured surprise. She embraced him briefly, exchanged a few quiet words, and then introduced him simply as Derek. The name struck me immediately, a name I'd never heard before in our circle. There was no explanation, no effort to hide his identity. But that look he'd given me earlier, the one that said without words that he knew more than he should, made my heart start pounding. Throughout the evening. I kept stealing glances at Derek. Every time our eyes met, I felt that same intense, unspoken message. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia. Perhaps he was simply an old friend of Emily's who I had never met. But as the night went on, subtle clues piled up. I noticed that while most of our guests mingled and chatted, Derek seemed to linger around the perimeter of the gathering, always watching, almost as if he were waiting for something. And then there was the way Emily's smile softened when she spoke to him. Just a fraction of a second longer than when she spoke to anyone else. I couldn't shake the memory of his look, a mix of defiance and a dark promise. Later that night, after the party had wound down and the guests had left, I sat in the quiet of our living room with only the hum of the refrigerator for company. Emily was busy in the kitchen, cleaning up, while Sophie was fast asleep upstairs after a night full of excitement. My mind raced over the events of the evening. That one glance from Derek had felt like a silent message, a secret he shared with Emily, a betrayal waiting to be uncovered. I replayed the scene in my head over and over. I remembered how Emily had hesitated for just a moment when introducing him, as if she was deciding how much to reveal. I recalled Derek's eyes, cold, calculating, and disturbingly familiar with something that wasn't meant for me to know. My gut churned with unease. I tried to convince myself that perhaps I was overreacting, that the look could be misinterpreted. But deep inside, I felt a growing sense of betrayal that I couldn't ignore. I went to our study, sat down at the desk, and turned on the computer. I began to search social media profiles, and even tried to recall any past interactions with Emily where she might have mentioned a Derek. There was nothing obvious, yet every instinct in my body told me that this man was not here by chance. I thought about the countless evenings when Emily had stayed late at work or taken unexpected phone calls in the other room. Every small detail, every unaccounted moment, now took on a sinister new meaning. By the time I finally went to bed that night, sleep was a distant thought. I lay in the darkness, my mind reeling with doubts and suspicions. The warmth and security I once felt in my home had given way to a cold, creeping dread. And all because of one unexpected guest, whose silent look had said everything. I resolved that when morning came, I would find the answers I needed. No matter how painful they might be, morning light seeped through the curtains, but it did little to warm the chill that had taken residence in me. I awoke before dawn, restless and determined, my mind still haunted by the image of Derek's penetrating stare. I forced myself out of bed, aware that I had to gather my thoughts and prepare for the day ahead. I joined Emily in the kitchen, where she was making coffee with her usual gentle smile. But today, her smile didn't reach her eyes, and I couldn't help but wonder if she sensed the storm that had already begun to form inside me after breakfast. I decided to start my own investigation. I told myself it was just a matter of getting clarity on who Derek was and why he'd come unannounced to our family celebration. Over the next few days, I kept a close watch on Emily's behavior. I noticed little things. A lingering glance at the phone when he buzzed in the middle of the day, hushed whispers when she thought I wasn't listening. I started to recall memories. Evenings when she'd seemed distracted, excuses that never quite added up. My suspicion, once a small ember, was rapidly growing into a blazing fire point one afternoon. I found a moment of solitude. I slipped away to the garage under the guise of checking on some tools. In the dim light, I examined our family calendar and noticed that over the past few months, there were numerous evenings marked as late meetings or network events that I hadn't questioned before. Now, every unexplained absence seemed to lead straight to a shadow of deceit. I even recalled that on a few occasions, I caught her quickly hiding her phone when I entered the room, determined to uncover the truth. I began to scour through old messages on our shared computer. I discovered fragments of conversations that hinted at something more than just professional obligations. There were moments when Emily's tone shifted, a familiarity with someone whose name I didn't recognize. My heart pounded as I pieced together these fragments. The more I found, the more it seemed that Derek wasn't just an incidental guest. He was a symbol of a secret life my wife had been living behind my back. That evening, I waited for Emily to return home from one of her meetings. The house was quiet, the air thick with unspoken tension. I sat in the living room, the glow of the television barely cutting through the darkness that had settled in my heart. I replayed the events of the celebration again. The way Derek's eyes had locked with mine, that single, damning look that had conveyed a message of betrayal. I knew then that this wasn't an innocent mistake. It was a calculated act of infidelity as the night deepened. I began planning my next steps. I wasn't content with simply knowing the truth. I needed to act on it. I recalled a friend from my younger days, a man named Rick, who had once taught me how to fight, how to channel anger into strength. I reached out to him discreetly, explaining that I needed to learn how to defend myself, and perhaps how to make those who hurt me understand that betrayal was a wound that demanded retribution. Rick agreed to meet me the following morning at a local gym known for its no-nonsense approach to training, A.T. the gym. Amidst the sound of punching bags and clanging weights, I began to transform. Every jab I threw, every bead of sweat, became a promise that I would no longer be a victim. I pushed my body to its limits, preparing myself for a confrontation that was as inevitable as it was dangerous. With every drop of exertion, I felt that simmering rage solidify into a purpose, to expose the truth, to confront the man who had wormed his way into my family, and to make him, and Emily, pay for every lie. Late that evening, after my training session, I drove home with a newfound determination. I knew that tomorrow I would confront Emily. I needed answers from her, and I needed to see if her eyes would betray the same secret that Derek's had. My mind churned with conflicting emotions, anger, sadness, and an overwhelming need for justice. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this betrayal wasn't just about infidelity. It was about the erosion of trust, the dismantling of a life I had built with my own two hands. That as I parked in our driveway, I saw Emily in the kitchen, laughing softly with a neighbor who had stayed late to help clean up after the party. Their conversation was light and casual, but I could see the same guarded expression in her eyes that I had noticed on the day of the celebration. That expression, combined with the evidence I had gathered, confirmed my worst suspicions. I was no longer willing to sit idly by and let deception rule our lives. I had resolved to take matters into my own hands, both to protect what remained of my dignity and to exact a punishment that would echo in the hearts of those who had betrayed me that night. As I lay awake planning my next move, I couldn't help but replay the memory of Derek's look, a silent promise of secrets, of a world that I had been kept in the dark about. It was a look that said everything, and it had lit a fire within me that could not be extinguished. The following evening, I knew it was time. The tension that had been building for days reached its breaking point as I stepped out of the car and walked toward a dimly lit parking lot behind a downtown bar. My heart was pounding, not just from adrenaline, but from the weight of a betrayal that had festered too long. I'd arranged to meet Derek there, a confrontation I couldn't delay any longer. I wasn't entirely sure what I expected from him, an explanation, a confession, or simply a chance to vent my wrath. All I knew was that I had to face him head-on. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only a few scattered cars and the distant hum of city traffic. I found him leaning casually against the hood of his sleek black sedan, his posture relaxed, as if he were waiting for an old friend. When he saw me approaching, his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. There was no greeting, no attempt to hide his surprise. Instead, his gaze was steady and cold, as though he were expecting this moment all along. "Derek," I said, my voice low and controlled, though every word vibrated with the intensity of my pent-up rage. "We need to talk." He smirked, the gesture both dismissive and mocking. "Jason, isn't it? I wasn't expecting you tonight." His tone was light, almost casual, but it carried an undercurrent of challenge. I took a step closer, closing the distance until I could see the fine details. The slight twitch of his lip, the almost imperceptible glisten in his eye that hinted at regret or perhaps anticipation. "Your look at our celebration said it all," I replied, the words bitter on my tongue. "It wasn't just a friendly visit, was it?" For a split second, his confident facade wavered. His eyes darted away, and I could see something flicker there, a moment of hesitation, guilt, or calculation. "I don't know what you mean," he replied coolly, though his voice betrayed a trace of uncertainty. That was all I needed. I lunged forward before he could react, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him against the cool metal of a parked car. The force of my anger was raw and unfiltered. I didn't want answers right away. I wanted him to feel every ounce of the betrayal that had been inflicted upon my family. The night air was filled with the sound of our struggle, a mix of grunts, the rustle of fabric, and the harsh scraping of fists against skin. Derek tried to fight back, his hands scrambling in defense, but I was fueled by a fury that I had been cultivating for weeks. Every punch I threw was a testament to the pain I'd endured, every shove a rejection of the lies that had poisoned my home. I could feel his body weaken under the onslaught, and with each blow, I hoped he'd understand that my life would never be the same again. After what felt like an eternity of violence in that dark parking lot, I finally forced him to the ground. Panting heavily, I stared down at him, my hands still trembling with adrenaline. "Tell me," I hissed, "what have you done with my wife?" The question wasn't merely about infidelity. It was a demand for accountability, a demand for the truth behind every lie. That Derek's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite read, fear, defiance, or perhaps even sorrow. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. But even as he spoke, I could see that his gaze held a secret, one that confirmed my worst suspicions. Without him uttering another word, Diane, that moment, as I stood over him, I realized that this confrontation was only the beginning. The physical violence had been a necessary release, a way to validate the betrayal I felt so deeply. But it wasn't enough. I needed to dismantle the entire web of deception that had ruined my life. I needed to ensure that every stolen moment, every lie, would be repaid in full. With one final shove, I forced Derek to his feet, my eyes never leaving his. "This is only the start," I warned in a low, menacing tone. "You and everyone who's been a part of this mess will pay. I'm not done yet." I turned and walked away, leaving him slumped against the car, battered and broken. An omen of the retribution that was still to come. In the days that followed, the violent encounter with Derek burned in my mind like an unquenchable flame. I returned to the daily routines of my life, but nothing was the same. Every glance from Emily, every casual word, now carried the weight of my suspicion. I began to notice how she'd be extra cautious with her phone, how her laughter sometimes faded when she thought I wasn't listening. And all the while, I felt that same searing need for justice intensified. My nights became consumed with relentless training at the gym. I worked every muscle until I could no longer feel the dull ache of exhaustion, only the raw, unadulterated strength of determination. Under the harsh lights and the relentless rhythm of punches on heavy bags, I transformed. I wasn't just preparing for another confrontation. I was forging myself into the embodiment of vengeance late one night. As I reviewed the evidence I'd collected, screenshots of suspicious messages, call logs, and fragments of conversations, I realized that Derek was not the only man involved. Emily had cultivated a network of secrets, and each name I uncovered was a stain on the life I thought we'd built. But it was her betrayal that cut deepest. The vision of that unexpected guest look at our celebration was seared into my memory, a silent testament to the life that had been hidden behind smiles and empty promises. Driven by a need to reclaim my honor, I decided to confront Emily directly. I arranged for a private conversation in the quiet hours of the early morning, when the rest of the house was asleep. As I sat in the dim light of our living room, I waited for her to return from her nightly routine. When she finally appeared, her eyes were downcast, and I could see the weight of guilt lurking beneath the surface. "Emily," I began, my voice steady but laced with barely contained fury, "I need you to explain everything." I didn't care for her excuses, her feeble attempts to justify a life of secrets. I demanded the truth, and I demanded it now. Her eyes filled with tears as she stammered a half-hearted apology, but the words were drowned out by the relentless pounding of my heart. I saw in her eyes that she had known this day would come, that she had been living a lie for far too long. The conversation turned bitter quickly, as I recounted every moment of suspicion, every lie that had led me to this point. My words were harsh and unyielding, and I could see the pain they inflicted. But I wasn't there to seek forgiveness. I was there to deliver retribution. The physical violence with Derek had been only the first step. Now, I needed to dismantle the very foundation of the betrayal that had been built in our home. I warned her that I wasn't finished, that the faces behind her deceit would soon come to know the full measure of my wrath. As the words left my mouth, I felt a mixture of sorrow and satisfaction. I had lost something precious, trust, love, the idea of a peaceful life. But in its place, I had gained a cold, relentless resolve. I told her that every secret, every lie, would be repaid in blood if necessary. The look in her eyes was one of utter defeat, a silent acknowledgement that there was no going back after that night. The house became a battleground of silent tensions. I moved through the rooms with an air of menace, and every creak of the floorboard reminded me of the promise I had made to myself. I continued my training, sharpening my skills and preparing for the inevitable encounters with the other men whose names had surfaced in my investigation. My mind was focused solely on one purpose: to break every link in the chain of betrayal that had torn my life apart. I began to plan a series of confrontations, each carefully orchestrated to send a message. I would hunt down those responsible one by one and force them to confront the consequences of their actions. I knew that the path I had chosen was dark and irreversible, but there was no turning back now. Every moment of happiness I once knew had been stolen by deception, and I was determined to reclaim my life through a series of brutal, unforgiving acts of retribution. As the days bled into weeks, the intensity of my resolve grew. I would no longer be the passive husband, the silent sufferer. I was Jason Miller now, a man reborn in anger, with every bruise and every scar a testament to the price of betrayal. And with every passing day, I felt the darkness inside me solidify, ready to erupt and consume anyone who had dared to cross me. The final confrontation came on a rain-soaked night that felt as if the heavens themselves mourned the loss of innocence. I had tracked down the last name on my list, another man who had played his part in Emily's secret life. With every encounter before this, I had honed my technique and steeled my resolve. Tonight, I was determined to end this chapter of betrayal once and for all. I met the man in a deserted warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place as cold and unforgiving as the path I had chosen. My hands still throbbed from the previous fights, but I welcomed the pain. It was a reminder of every lie, every stolen moment. In the vast, echoing space, under flickering industrial lights, I confronted him. The look in his eyes was one of sheer terror as he recognized the grim determination in mine. I delivered a barrage of blows that left him battered and broken, a living embodiment of every transgression that had brought me to this point. But as I stood over him, catching my breath in the cold silence of the warehouse, a sudden, overwhelming thought struck me. I had set out to reclaim my honor, to restore balance to my shattered life, and yet all I felt was an unyielding emptiness. The violence, the bloodshed, it had consumed me, leaving behind a shell of the man I once was. In that moment of grim clarity, I realized that vengeance had its own price, one that might forever trap me in a cycle of regret and darkness. Still, I couldn't let it end there. I had one final reckoning to confront, the person who had sparked this entire chain of events. That night, under the heavy weight of rain and sorrow, I returned home. Emily was waiting in the living room, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a despair that mirrored my own. The confrontation was inevitable. There were no words that could erase the betrayal, no apologies that could heal the deep wounds inflicted on my soul. "Emily," I said, my voice trembling with both fury and grief, "this ends now." I advanced slowly, each step a painful reminder of all that had been lost. The ensuing struggle was as much an emotional release as it was a physical battle. Fists flew in a blur of anger and anguish, and in that chaotic exchange, I forced her to face the reality of our crumbling life. I wasn't aiming for death, only the kind of retribution that would make her feel every ounce of the pain she'd inflicted on me. When the struggle finally subsided, the silence that fell over our home was deafening. I stood there, chest heaving, looking down at the woman who had once been my life. In her eyes, I saw regret, sorrow, and an unspoken plea for forgiveness that would never come. I realized, with a grim finality, that no amount of violence could restore what had been broken. The American dream I once believed in was gone, replaced by a legacy of betrayal and bloodshed. I am the cold light of dawn. As I stepped outside and listened to the soft patter of rain on the pavement, I knew that my journey was over, but so was my old life. I had become an avenger, a man marked by his own darkness, forever bound to the consequences of a single, unexpected guest look at a family celebration. That look had spoken volumes, and it had set in motion a chain of events that would haunt me for the rest of my days. I drove away from the house that morning, the weight of every action etched into my soul. The path of vengeance, I realized, was a lonely one. Yet as I merged onto the highway with the rising sun on the horizon, I carried with me the bitter certainty that sometimes betrayal demands a price far higher than one can ever truly pay.